My name is Robert W. Asbury. The W stands for Washington. I'm a descendant of Samuel Washington. Now, Sam's older brother was George Washington, Commander and General of the Continental Army and first President of the United States of America. About once a year, my wife and I go back to visit the birthplace and childhood home of my great-grandmother. Her name was Mary Elizabeth Washington. The home is called Cedar Lawn. It's located near Charlestown, West Virginia. Now, Mary's mother was Elizabeth Washington, but her maiden name was Elizabeth Bedinger. I always wanted to learn a little more about the Bedinger side of our family, and so a few years back, we took a short 9-mile drive up to Shepherdstown, the birthplace and childhood home of Elizabeth Bedinger. Walking about the town, we came across an old graveyard. As we wandered through the old grave sites, we came upon a sandstone slab. The name read, Daniel Bedinger. It was the gravesite of Elizabeth Washington's father, my third great-grandfather. The inscription read, Daniel Bedinger, a soldier of the American Revolution. This discovery lit a fire of curiosity that started me on a journey that would reveal the amazing story of a boy in the American Revolution and birth of the United States Army. This story begins with a family, the Bedinger family. By 1775, the family consisted of 5 boys, 3 girls, and their widowed mother. The 3 brothers germane to this story are Henry the eldest at age 18, Michael was 16, and Daniel, 14 years old. They lived near the town of Shepherdstown in Berkeley County, Virginia. At the time, the area was considered the frontier of the Shenandoah Valley. It was a sparsely populated region with considerable instability due to Indian hostilities and raids. In April of 1775, an event some 600 miles north of Berkeley County, Virginia took place that would ultimately change the course of world events. In the colony of Massachusetts, the city of Boston was in effect under martial law due to a little incident known as the Boston Tea Party. The port closed for business by order of King George III. Tensions were at a breaking point. On the evening of April 19th, British soldiers marched out of Boston and raided the hamlets of Lexington and Concord. Shots erupted during a standoff on Lexington Green. When the smoke cleared, 12 patriots lay dead on the green. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. Soon, Minutemen from surrounding hamlets and counties swarmed to the scene of action. By the time the British units finished their operations and escaped back to Boston, they had suffered 165 casualties. The Great War for American independence had begun. On May 10th, just 2 weeks after Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress was called to meet again in Philadelphia. This time, the mood of Congress was markedly changed since the First Congress, which had met just 6 months earlier. The King's Army had attacked citizens of Massachusetts, and indignation was universal. As delegates from the various colonies began to arrive in the city, the atmosphere was intense. Reading through their correspondence, a clear picture of determination and resolve emerges. Ben Franklin wrote to his friend David Hartley. He writes, "You will have heard before this reaches you of the commencement of a civil war. The end of it perhaps neither myself nor you may live to see. I find here all ranks of people in arms, disciplining themselves morning and evening, and I am informed that the firmest union prevails throughout North America." Richard Henry Lee, delegate from Virginia, writes a friend. He writes, "There never appeared more perfect unanimity among any set of men than among the delegates, and indeed all of the old provinces, not one excepted, are directed by the same firmness of union and determination to resist by all ways and in every extremity. Joseph Hughes, a delegate from North Carolina, writes, "Nothing is heard but the sounds of drum and fifes. All ranks and all degrees of men are in arms, learning the manual exercise and management of artillery. They have now in this city 28 companies of foot of 68 men each, including officers, all of whom are out twice every day in training. Several more companies are forming. They have also 2 companies of light horse. In short, it is impossible to describe the spirit of these people and the alteration they have undergone since I left them in December last." On May 10th, Peyton Randolph, President of Congress, calls for a special session of Congress to meet behind closed doors to consider the state of American affairs. In short, how to defend Boston, how to organize a defensive strategy, in essence, how to form an army. One fascinating topic of discussion at this meeting concerned the extraordinary abilities of those people living along the Shenandoah frontier. These were woodsmen and hunters proficient with the use of what is known as the long rifle. The long rifle, also known as a Kentucky rifle or Pennsylvania rifle, was one of the first commonly used rifles for hunting and warfare in colonial America. It's characterized by its unusually long barrel, which is widely believed to be a unique development of American rifles that was uncommon in European rifles of the same period. When compared to the British Brown Bess musket, the long rifle presented a decided advantage. The long rifle was accurate for distances up to 200 yards and beyond. The Brown Bess was questionable beyond 40 yards. The Special Committee of Congress decided to raise 10 companies of these frontier riflemen to help defend Massachusetts. They were to include 2 companies from Maryland, 2 from Virginia, and 6 from Pennsylvania. On the June 15th session of Congress, John Adams nominates George Washington to take command of the Army of the United Colonies. Congress approves. Washington accepts and is ordered to proceed immediately to Cambridge, near Boston, to take command of the American forces. John Hancock, the new President of Congress, wrote about the proceedings on that day in a letter to Eldridge Gerry at Cambridge. He writes, "Colonel Washington is appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. I will sign his commission tomorrow, and he will depart in a few days. He is a fine man. You will judge of the propriety of the mode of his reception. 10 companies of fine riflemen from this province, Maryland, and Virginia are ordered to proceed immediately to your army." These 10 companies represent the first recruitment of a national army by Congress. That same day, he wrote to Dr. Joseph Warren in Boston. He writes, "The Congress have ordered 10 companies of riflemen from this province, Maryland, and Virginia, of 94 men each, properly officered, to proceed immediately to join the army near Boston. This is a good step and will be an excellent additional strength to our forces. These are the finest marksmen in the world. They do executions with their rifles at amazing distance." So now we return to the Bedinger family of Shepherdstown, Virginia. Growing up in this rugged frontier community, the Bedinger boys were well known as excellent hunters and crack marksmen with the long rifle. Before General Washington left for Cambridge, he appointed 2 officers to lead the 2 Virginia rifle companies. Captain Daniel Morgan was to raise his company at Winchester. Captain Hugh Stevenson was picked to raise his company based at Shepherdstown in Berkeley County. Among the first recruits solicited by Captain Stevenson for the Berkeley Rifle Company were the 2 elder Bedinger boys, Henry and Michael. Henry was commissioned 4th sergeant of the new company, and Michael a corporal. For young Daniel, 14 years of age, it was a different story. Although he begged to join his brothers in arms, His widowed mother and his elder brothers would not consent. Daniel would have to remain behind. It's fascinating to note how quickly the two Virginia companies were recruited. In a letter written after the war, Henry Bedinger recalled the recruiting process of the Berkeley Company. He also talks about the spirit of competition that developed between the two Virginia companies. He writes, "Great exertions were made by each captain to complete his company first, that merit might be claimed on that account. Volunteers presented themselves from every direction in the vicinity of these towns. None were received but young men of character and of sufficient property to clothe themselves completely, find their own arms and accoutrements, that is, an approved rifle, handsome shot pouch and powder horn, blanket, knapsack, and such decent clothing as should be prescribed, but which was at first ordered to be only a hunting shirt and pantaloons fringed on every edge and in various ways." By the second week of July, both companies were filled. On July 16th, a curious event happened. A barbecue was held as a send-off to honor the troops enlisted in Captain Stevenson's Berkeley County Rifle Company. The barbecue was held at a site known as Morgan Springs near Shepherdstown, that being the property of William Morgan. A description of this event was recorded by Dansky Danridge, the granddaughter of Daniel Bedinger. She writes, "Crowds of citizens, their wives and daughters attended the barbecue. An ox was roasted whole, and long tables of rough flanks were heaped with tasty fixings, including suckling pigs, wild turkeys, venison, and a great store of vegetable, cakes, and pastries. At this grand feast it is said that toasts were given, patriotic songs sung, and much martial music." Certainly there must have been also a serious component to the event. Fathers, brothers, sons, wives, mothers, all soon to be separated. The new recruits preparing to engage the world's most powerful army. Dandridge goes on to write, "When the young recruits were about to separate for the night, they all arose, and taking hold of hands around the table, they solemnly pledged among themselves, as many as survived, to meet again at this place 50 years later." I would like to pause here and insert an interesting story. A few years back, I was in Shepherdstown researching this story. I really wanted to find these hollowed springs where this historic event took place. I was directed to a county park and found a monument that implied that it sat on the site of this historic springs. I took some photos and went on my way. Later that day, I ran into a former professor of history at Shepherdstown College, Dr. John E. Steele III, and he invited me to his home just outside of town. In our conversation, he told me that the actual muster site was not at the park, but located about a half a mile from his house and is now on private property. Inquiring with the owner of the farm, I was given permission to stroll around the springs at my leisure. I am truly grateful of the professor and the kindness of the landowner. As I walked around this peaceful site, I could almost smell the aromas from the barbecue and hear the voices of men, women, and children as they celebrated their time together before the company's departure. Affixed to the wall of this old spring house, a plaque reads, "The stone building above this spring was built in the 1730s. The first permanent dwelling of Richard Morgan, one of the original settlers in the area." On July 17th of 1775, Captain Hugh Stevenson's company of Virginia riflemen met at this spring to begin its beeline march to Boston to join General Washington and his Revolutionary Army. Let's now take a quick look at the scope of the march these two rifle companies were to embark on. The distance from northern Virginia to Cambridge, near Boston, is a little over 600 miles. Although at the time there were established roads linking villages and towns, in many instances there was little more than a primitive trail connecting this route. On July 17th, Captain Stevenson mustered the Berkeley Company at the Old Springs to begin their march into history. The company consisted of 94 men, 4 lieutenants, 1 ensign, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, 1 surgeon, and 80 privates. We can only imagine what this march must have been like. One thing we do know, it was grueling. I found one entry in Sergeant Henry Bedinger's diary that I think you'll find interesting. He writes, "New Windsor. Met a fellow who called himself Colonel Thompson, a colonel of the Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion. Found him to be an impostor. We took him in the morning and stripped his clothes, put him in the highest place in town, and gave him a severe tarring and feathering. Then took him to the river to one of the wharfs and gave him a severe ducking." On August 11th, 27 days after departing the Springs, Captain Stevenson's Berkeley County Company arrived at Washington's headquarters, accomplishing the march in just over 3 weeks, hence the name Beeline March was forever attached to this feat. The arrival of the 2 Virginia rifle companies at Cambridge did not go unnoticed. A gentleman by the name of Mr. Thatcher wrote about it. He writes, "They are remarkably stout and hardy men, many of them exceeding 6 feet in height. They are dressed in white frocks of rifle shirts and round hats. These men are remarkable for the accuracy of their aim, striking a mark with great certainty at 200 yards distance. At a review, a company of them, while on quick advance, fired their balls into objects of 7 inches diameter at a distance of 250 yards. They are now stationed on our lines, and their shots have frequently proved fatal to British officers and soldiers who expose themselves to view even at more than double the distance of a common musket shot." At this juncture, I'll fast forward 1 year. Suffice to say that the biggest event the Virginia Rifle Companies encountered was in December, when the Continental Army in one night slipped to the top of Dorchester Heights and installed a complete complement of artillery. The result of this action sent the British Army packing, abandoning its base in Boston to fight another day. On July 4, 1776, Congress declared independence from Great Britain and the King. As the delegates of the Second Congress prepared to depart, Ben Franklin summed up their precarious situation by declaring, quote, "We must all hang together, gentlemen, else we will most assuredly all hang separately." At about this time, Captain Stevenson was promoted to colonel and senior commander of both the Virginia and Maryland Rifle Companies. Henry Bedinger was promoted to lieutenant. By the end of July, all enlistments for the Rifle Company had run out. Colonel Stevenson and Lieutenant Bedinger returned to Berkeley County to recruit and rebuild the rifle companies. A sad event transpired while recruitment was in progress. Colonel Stevenson became ill and passed away in a few days. Overall command was now delegated to Lieutenant Moses Rawlings of the Maryland Company. By the first week of September, the Berkeley Company was back to full strength. On September 7th, the company mustered at the Old Springs, now renamed Stevenson Springs, in honor of the late Colonel Stevenson. Just prior to this second march, an intriguing story began to unfold. Remember young Daniel Bedinger, now 15 years old, again begged his mother and brothers to join the cause. Many years after the war, Daniel Bedinger's son wrote this memoir regarding his father's predicament. He writes, "At the expiration of about 12 months, his brothers returned home, and when the time for the second departure arrived, the wonderful tales they had narrated of their life in camp had wrought so upon my father's youthful, ardent imagination that he besought them and his mother with tears in his eyes to suffer him to accompany them. But they, regarding his youth, would not give their consent, and they took their departure without him. However, upon their arrival in camp at Bergen, they were astonished at the arrival of my father, he having run off from home and followed them all the way on foot, and now appeared before them, haggard, weary, and half-starved by the length of his march. At this point, it is essential to understand the strategic situation of the war. It had changed considerably since the first march for the relief of Boston. By the end of July, a British expeditionary force of 32,000 soldiers under the command of General Howe had landed on Staten Island, the largest army ever fielded outside the European continent. By the middle of October, General Howe had effectively driven the Continental Army from Long Island. The army then failed to hold New York and retreated north to Peekskill. General Howe decided not to follow, but turned his attention to the only two strongholds left on the Hudson River, Fort Washington on the New York side and Fort Lee on the New Jersey side. About this time, the newly rebuilt Berkeley, Virginia Rifle Company, along with the Maryland Rifle Company, made their way north. Their orders to proceed towards the Hudson River and reinforce the defenders of Fort Washington. And so was the predicament that the Berkeley Rifle Company marched into in mid-October. Lieutenant Henry Bedinger's diary records the march and their arrival at the fort. He writes, "Our company being filled, we marched early in September to our rendezvous at Bergen. So soon as the regiment was formed, it was ordered up the North River to the English neighborhood, and in a short time ordered to cross the river and assist in the defense of Fort Washington, where were about 3,000 men under the command of Colonel McGaw on Manhattan Island." Within days of their arrival, some 10,000 British and Hessian troops arrived. Howe moved to surround the fort. To further compound this desperate situation, the Royal Navy positioned several frigates to isolate the forts.
Forward! March!
Lieutenant Bedinger's journal goes on to say, "On the 15th of November, the great British General Patterson appeared with a flag near our guards and demanded a surrender of Fort Washington and the garrison. Colonel McGaw replied he should defend it to the last extremity." British Field Commander General Patterson declared, "All is ready to storm the lines and the fort. Our rifle company prepared for battle." The next morning, the siege began. The Berkeley and Maryland Rifle Companies were tasked with defending the northern approaches to the fort. The attack on the north side of the fort began with an artillery barrage launched from frigates and land positions along the foothills of the northern shore. Returning now to Lieutenant Henry Bedinger's diaries, he writes, "The artillery of the British were endeavoring to clear the hill while their troops crossing the valleys were ascending it, but without much effect. A few of our men were killed with cannon and grape shot. Not a shot was fired on our side until the enemy had nearly gained the summit. Although at least 5 times our numbers, our rifles brought down so many of them that they gave up several times, but by their overwhelming numbers they at last succeeded in possessing the summit. Here, however, was great carnage, each making every effort to possess and hold so advantageous a position." In other written accounts, more details of the battle can be found. Quote, "By 1 p.m. the battle on the summit was raging and losses began to mount. Several officers of the rifle regiments were wounded, including the commanders, Colonel Rawlins and Major Williams. Captain Shepard, being the senior officer, took command of the regiment, and they fought on, putting up a stubborn resistance. But with the arrival of the British field pieces and overwhelming numbers, the regiment began a measured retreat. At about 4 p.m., the remaining riflemen escaped into the confines of the fort. According to written accounts, Daniel had performed very well indeed. He was one of 50 riflemen chosen and stationed in the vanguard as a final repulse guarding the northern perimeter of the fort. By late afternoon, defenders of the fort on all sides were driven from the field and the fort completely surrounded. It had been a bloody day on all sides, but there is no doubt that the British and Hessians, with some 900 casualties, had paid a high price for their prize. According to the battle reports, young Daniel, then a little past 15, shot 27 rounds during the engagement, and was often heard to say after discharging his piece, "Take that, you devils!" His youthful intrepidity and gallant conduct so particularly attracted the attention of the officers that, though taken prisoner, he was promoted to an ensigncy, his commission dating back 6 months that he might take precedence of the other ensigns of his company. Lieutenant Bedinger wrote this account about the surrender. Quote, "The enemy began at sundown to break ground within 100 yards of the fort. Finding our situation desperate, Colonel McGaw dispatched a flag to General Howe, who commanded in person, proposing to surrender on certain conditions, which, not being agreed upon, other terms were proposed and accepted. The garrison, consisting of 2,673 privates and 210 officers, marched out, grounded arms, and were guarded to the White House that same night. But instead of being treated as agreed upon, and allowed to retain baggage, clothes, and sidearms, every valuable article was torn away from both officers and soldiers. Every sword, pistol, and every good hat was seized, even in the presence of British officers, and the garrison was considered and treated as rebels to king and country." From this point, the plight and sacrifice endured by America's first enlisted rifle companies is a sad and little-known story. Lieutenant Bedinger continues his account, quote, "After 3 days, the garrison was escorted under guard to New York, where they were fed spoiled foods, the first time since their capture. Officers were separated from the ranks and billeted in abandoned houses with no provisions but to fend for themselves. Our poor soldiers fared most wretchedly. They were crowded into sugar houses and jails without blankets or coverings, had very little given to them to eat, and that little of the very worst quality, so that in 2 months and 4 days about 1,900 of Fort Washington's troops had died." The term sugar house refers to a number of buildings used by the British Army to house prisoners in New York City. There were 3 of these structures. Before the war, they were used to store sugar and molasses, destined for refineries. Sadly, little attention or consideration is given to memorialize these enlisted soldiers who suffered and perished in these horrific prisons. An inconspicuous remnant of this awful chapter in the American War of Independence is still visible, located just yards from one police plaza in Lower Manhattan. Today, few people in this area are even aware of this token remnant of American history. Returning now to our story, Ethan Allen, notable officer of the Revolution and a prisoner at New York, also left a painful description regarding the treatment of American prisoners of low rank. He writes, "For those who had the misfortune to fall into the enemy's hands at Fort Washington were reserved from immediate death to famish and die from hunger. In fine, the word rebel was thought by the enemy sufficient to sanctify whatever cruelties they were pleased to inflict, death itself not exempted." In the 1830s, Dr. Lyman C. Draper spent the better part of his life compiling a history called the Trans-Allegheny West. He interviewed dozens of frontiersmen, including surviving veterans of the Revolutionary War. The writings include some 500 volumes. Some of the interviews by Dr. Draper include the recollections of Michael Bedinger. These included specifically stories about the Bee Line March and the Virginia Rifle Company. Because of the interviews conducted by Dr. Draper, we are able to pick up the story of the 15-year-old boy soldier, Daniel Bedinger, captured at the surrender of Fort Washington. Dr. Draper writes, "Daniel was incarcerated first at the old sugar house on Liberty Street in New York. Eventually, in a weakened state, Daniel was transferred to the prison ship Whitby in New York Harbor. The first ships used by the British to hold prisoners were originally transports in which cattle and other stores were carried across the Atlantic. The first prison ship was the Whitby. The captives aboard were allowed to keep their clothing and bedding, but received no more of such commodities while on the ship. They were given no medical attention. The rations they received were either cut or substituted with unwholesome meat by corrupt British commissionaries. The men aboard the Whitby, seeing no hope for any exchange, set fire to their ship in October of 1777, choosing death in the flames to lingering sufferings of disease and starvation. On Christmas Eve of 1776, a significant event unfolded. General Washington, thought to have been defeated, crossed the icy Delaware River and captured the British outpost at Trenton, an astonishing victory. A few days after this event, British General Howe sent Cornwallis to destroy the upstart Continental Army. Upon reaching Trenton, Cornwallis found the Continental Army dug in along the south banks of Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis planned a massive morning attack to finish off the Continentals. But when dawn broke, they found only smoldering campfires. Washington had slipped away during the night, and the next day defeated the British garrison at Princeton, a stunning turn of events, effectively driving the British Army completely out of the Jerseys. Strangely enough, these stunning victories may have well saved the life of young Daniel, who was near death on the Whitby prison ship. Suddenly, the Continental Army had in their possession some 3,000 plus British prisoners of war. General Howe was now compelled to consider the treatment of British prisoners and consider the realization that the Continental Army could well launch offensive actions against their base in New York. Whatever the case, it seems that General Howe changed his position on prisoner exchanges and agreed to a more equitable schedule. For the pitiful few Continental soldiers still clinging to life in New York prisons and ships, their prospects suddenly brightened. Quoting again from Dr. Draper's interviews, he writes, "It came nearly too late for young Daniel. Before the first exchange was effected, the poor boy had apparently yielded to despair and turned his face to the wall to die. Yet one more quirk of fate presented in Daniel's favor. Growing up in the Bedinger home, Daniel's grandmother and grandfather were both German immigrants, and so German was a familiar language to all the siblings. Communicating with one of his Hessian guards on the prison ship, Daniel began a rapport. Apparently, the guard was moved by his youthful innocence and became sympathetic to the boy's desperate situation." Dansky Danreg goes on to write about the boy's plight. Quote, "When the officers in charge went among the prisoners, selecting those who were to be exchanged, they twice passed over the poor boy as too far gone to be moved. But he, with a sudden revival, begged and entreated the Hessian guard so pitifully not to be left behind, the young guard, said to have been an officer, declared that he would be responsible for him, and had him lifted and laid down in the bottom of a boat, as he was too feeble to sit or stand. In this condition he was accompanied by other prisoners to a church in New York, where the exchange was made and effected. One or more of the American surgeons accompanied the prisoners. By some means Daniel was conveyed to Philadelphia, where he completely collapsed and was taken to a military hospital. Sometime in January, Michael Bedinger, who was serving in a special unit stationed near Trenton, received word of his young brother's plight. Obtaining a temporary leave, he hurried to Philadelphia in a desperate attempt to locate and rescue him. It is told that Michael could never speak of the condition in which he found his young brother without his eyes filling with tears. Michael Bedinger's son, Dr. B.F. Bedinger, left a written account of this incredible story. Dr. Bedinger writes, "My father located the hospital in search of his brother, but did not recognize him. On further inquiry about former prisoners at the hospital, a voice from a darkened corner was heard. 'Yes, Michael, there is one.' Overcome by his feelings, my father knelt by the side of the poor emancipated boy and took him in his arms. He then transported him to a house where he could procure some comforts in the way of food and clothing. After this, he got an armchair, 2 pillows, and some leather straps. He placed his suffering and beloved charge in the chair, supported him by the pillows, swung him by the leather straps onto his back, and carried him some miles into the country. where he found a friendly asylum in the house of a Quaker family. Here he convalesced for several months, and through the kindness of this caring family, gained enough strength to be transported by wagon to his home in Berkeley County. And so it is here at this point that we return to the historic springs where our story began, where Captain Stevenson mustered a frontier rifle company and where the first recruits of the United States Army embarked on a 600-mile march into history. You may recall that just before their departure on June 10, 1775, a feast was given by a proud community for 96 of their finest, about to embark on America's struggle for independence. You will also recall that a vow was taken by all the recruits that as many who survive shall meet again 50 years later at this site to reunite and commemorate the occasion. Amazingly, this historic event did take place. After 50 years, according to the promises made to each other, 2 survivors of that day made their way back to the Springs. This event was reported in the Harper's Ferry Free Press. June 12, 1825. A party of ladies and gentlemen repaired on Friday the 10th of June to a spring, Mr. D. Morgan's, near Shepherdstown for the purpose of celebrating that day, pursuant to an arrangement made 50 years before. The circumstances which gave way to this truly interesting celebration has been related to us by a gentleman who was present. Quote, "By an agreement of these heroes of olden time, that the survivors of the perils they were about to encounter, and of the ravages of time, should meet again at these springs 50 years to come. Today, that promise has been fulfilled. Out of the 97 gallant spirits who compose the company, 5 only are living, and of the latter number but 2 are present." In a most touching scene, these 2 old men embraced, silently, with tears. The reunion marked a final farewell for these 2 former brothers-in-arms, for they would not see each other again. But they had been close, even before the march to war in 1775, for they were also brothers in blood, Henry and Michael Bedinger. The writer of the Free Press article, written now some 189 years past, made special reference to those 1,900 privates taken prisoner at Fort Washington. He then summed up his report with these words: "The whole affair recalled to mind the American colonies when they represented little more than a vast, uncultivated wilderness, the population declared to be in a state of rebellion. Advancing, they met the gibbet. Retreating, death or slavery. Turning to the right, they encountered bayonets. To the left, scalping knives. Without finance, without friends, and almost without hope. But now, America's sails whiten every ocean, and her suns visit every climate. What then would be the astonishment of one of these martyrs of liberty, who met a watery grave from the deck of a British prison ship, if he were to be suddenly transformed from the other world to this?" The original Berkeley County Rifle Company served with great distinction until the end of the war, participating in many key battles, including the British surrender at Yorktown, Virginia in 1782. Lieutenant Henry Bedinger was promoted to captain in 1781 and served until the end of the war. He died at his home near Shepherdstown, Virginia at age 90 in 1843. Michael Bedinger, after rescuing his brother, served 3 more voluntary tours as a rifleman. After the war, he helped pioneer the new frontier called Kentucky. In 1803, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Kentucky. He died in 1843, 84 years of age, at Blue Licks Springs, Kentucky. Daniel Bedinger, the boy soldier taken prisoner at Fort Washington, rejoined the Continental Army after regaining some health. He served as a rifleman under General Daniel Morgan till the end of the war. In 1802, he accepted the position of Navy agent of the Gosport Naval Yard at Norfolk, Virginia. Eventually, he built a beautiful home called Bedford at Shepherdstown, less than a mile from the old springs. The home was distinguished by 4 massive white columns on the front portico. The columns were in fact remnants from the refitted masts of the USS Constitution. Daniel Bedinger died in 1818 and is buried in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. His beloved Bedford home was burned to the ground in 1864 by order of Union General David Hunter.